Welcome everybody to the Roundtable. This event is part of a year-long thematic year on the part of the STEP Center dedicated to the exploration of natures, delving deeply into exploring different relationships with the natures we perceive in the world and exploring key questions around the language of crisis, coloniality, domination, alternatives, and future making. Today's event is titled Enchanting Nature, Tentacular Storytelling in the Great African Kelp Forest. And our roundtable today is made up of some of the members of the Sea Change Project. It's a small group of journalists, scientists, photographers, and filmmakers who develop a unique methodology and approach for learning about and telling stories about nature. The acclaimed Netflix documentary, My Octopus Teacher, is one example of the project's effective aesthetic and sensorial approach that focuses on connections, embodied experience, and interspecies learning to help people see and experience the great African kelp forest in new ways. The documentary has won numerous documentary and environmental film awards, and these include the Golden Panda, the Best of Festival Grand Teton Award at the Jackson Wild Film Festival, and the EarthX Best Feature Film. Sea Change is a really interesting project. Its philosophy and approach resonate with what Donna Haraway calls multi-species storytelling, in which, quote, multi-species players are enmeshed in partial and flawed translations across difference, but making new kinships and new ways of getting on together. Sea Change hopes that storytelling about connection, embodied experience, and interspecies learning can be a powerful vehicle to help others see the forest beneath the waves in new and radically different ways. But at the same time, their work raises important and often critical questions about the presentation and representation of more than human agencies and collaborations in practice. So thank you again for coming today. And just to open up the roundtable, I'd like to ask our participants to introduce themselves individually. We have 4 members of the Sea Change Project joining us. And I'd like you to just go around, maybe starting with Pippa, introduce yourself. What do you see as your role in the Sea Change Project? And what are your particular areas of interest or focus?
So my name is Pippa Ehrlich, and I am part of the Sea Change Project. I'm a science and conservation journalist, and now my focus is on filmmaking. And I was the editor of the Sea Change book and one of the directors of My Octopus Teacher. And I guess what I'm interested in is how our kind of storytelling can be useful as a kind of conservation tool. And also in stories about people and nature and our connection with the natural world that haven't been told in this way before, and why it's not the normal approach to conservation storytelling.
Who would like to go next? Swati?
Hi, so my name is Swati. I'm part of the Sea Change Project. I'm a conservation journalist by profession. I've made both documentary shorts for news, and I've made a couple of films. With Sea Change, again, what's exciting is the fact that storytelling is the core of who we are. And it's been an interesting arc for me, because as a journalist, when you do stories, you are telling stories, but you are also trying to constantly maintain a certain fairness and balance. It's always about every side to the story. And spending a lot of time in nature and seeing things that happen, I understand that that is the hallmark of journalism, but it's a bit limiting in the sense of not placing yourself in the story, because it's impossible to actually see the full picture if you're not placing yourself in what it is that you're observing, because what you're observing is very much informed by who is making that observation. So that's for me very interesting. And I've also come to the realization that sometimes you have to take a side. And in that kind of storytelling, it's not about taking a side to hammer home a point over someone's head where you don't agree with their opinion, but it's just that they're very clear on what your stand is in the story. So that's the part of it I find interesting. And as Pippa said, it's really forming that thread between the individual and the natural world in a way that feels organic, that feels natural, and in a way that then allows the person who's hearing the story or feeling that experience to want to change their lives or thoughts or whatever it might be in a more organic way, as opposed to in a way of, oh, you have to do something, or, you know, this is your survival or anything like that, but it's something that you want to do because you care. So that's the part that I'm interested in.
Thanks. Faine, you look ready.
Okay, sure. So I'm Faine Lopser, and I've been with the Sea Change Project for past, I think, 4 or 5 years. My background is in filmmaking, but I also manage like communication strategies and campaign strategies, so on the social media end. I've kind of always had a deep connection to nature and the sea from when I was tiny, so it's been something that's interested me for a long time. And I guess as a filmmaker, and not just filmmaker, I mean, I'm trying to find as many sort of media forms to convey it as possible, is finding ways to communicate the kind of sacredness that is felt in nature. And for me, that is, I think, my main interest, is to really share that incredible purity and sacredness within nature.
Thanks. Carina?
Hi everyone, thanks for inviting Sea Change. My name is Carina Frankal, and I have a background in media, commercial filmmaking, music videos, and became interested in documentary filmmaking probably about 20 some years ago. And I had the good fortune of sort of making my first documentary film with Craig Foster and his brother. And that was me. I was sold on that format of storytelling, and stayed in contact with Craig over the last 20 years, and sort of stumbled into Sea Change, just being attracted to the stories that are coming out of the kelp forest that Craig and co-founder Ross Freilink had started to document in the form of video and stills. And I guess the producer in me was going, well, what are you going to do with them? Like, what's going to happen? And Ross was going, I'm going to do a story on a sea point, on a promenade, which is a sea wall. And I was like, well, I'd love to help. And that was about 6-7 years ago. And Ross offered me the position of chair of the Sea Change Trust, which was a real privilege. And I get to tell a different story at Sea Change. It's sort of translating the creative into another creative language, which is communicating sort of a bird's eye view of what we do at Sea Change. And it's really been amazing. Speaking to different people, usually in the sort of financial or business world, to communicate our way of storytelling and ocean conservation, and invariably looking for partnerships or funding to go ahead and do the work that we're doing. And so that's been a real gift, and it's taken me a while to realize that as much as I want to go out and be creative, that it's another level of storytelling, another level of communicating, because you're speaking to different people in different realms. So yeah, Sea Change is very small. There's 4 of us today, but we're only 7. We're a team of 7, and we all jump in, I guess, when what's needed. And I'm looking forward to being here today and hearing what people have to ask and share with us. So thank you.
Thanks. I was wondering if it might be good to start with
Can I
one of
just
you.
introduce myself briefly?
Oh, I'm so sorry. Yes, I forgot to introduce our co-moderator, Adrian Nel. Please introduce yourself. Sorry.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, I'm Adrian Nel, based in the discipline of geography at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa. And for me, this is an interesting and personal project. I'm a long-time friend of Pippa, and Pippa, Amber, and I met up whilst attending a class workshop. Hi, Ben, I see you there. And this research project and the subsequent discussions which stem from that based in that encounter. And yeah, I'm very interested to hear the discussion throughout today, and I'll help with continuity and moderation.
Thanks. Sorry. Yeah, and I'm Amber Huff, and I'm based at the Institute of Development Studies and the STEP Center, and am working with Adrian and other members of Sea Change on a current project, as Adrian introduced. Sorry about that. Yeah, to kind of get us going, I was wondering if one of you would like to give us a little bit of background on what exactly is the kelp forest. So, I mean, we usually think of forests as being very terrestrial environments. And for some of us, I know some of us here are actually really familiar with the kelp forest as well as divers or swimmers. But for many of us, the idea of a forest underwater is very foreign and very alien. So, yeah, I was just wondering if one of you would like to tell us a little bit about what this is and what it's like to experience.
Okay, so the kelp forest, to start with, let's start with the geographical distribution. It covers 1/4 of the world's coastline. So even if people are not familiar with it, about 25% of the world's coastline is covered by kelp forests. Here, where we live in South Africa, it sort of extends for about 1,200 kilometers up our sort of west, towards Namibia. And then it extends out for about 100 meters depth on average into the ocean. This is giant marine algae. That's what kelp is. So it's part of the marine algal system that keeps the oceanic life in the oceans actually going, and life on Earth going in a big way, because it's from marine algae in the ocean, which is phytoplankton, really in a big way, that all of us breathe. So no matter where you live, every second breath that you take comes from the ocean, and that's thanks to marine algae. And kelp is part of that marine algal system, albeit it's a giant marine algae. Kelp in itself as a plant consists of sort of like a 3-dimensional structure. So it has a holdfast. So it doesn't have roots that go into the soil. It sort of holds on to rocky substrate at the bottom, at the benthic layer of the seabed. And then it rises up to the surface on these stipes that are gas filled. And then it has fronds on the top, or blades that the individual fronds are called. And it reaches up to the sun, as in any plant requires the sun for energy and food and all of that. And you get, of course, varieties of kelp, various species of kelp. And the one that we have here, which is what we see mostly when we say the underwater forest, in a sense, the big kelp that we get here is the bamboo kelp, or the Eclonia maxima. And it really is like an underwater forest when you go into the water. It's the Eclonia maxima rises to the surface, and the holdfast is on the benthic layer. And because of this structure, the leaves, the stipe, and the roots support a lot of life. So invariably, kelp forests are incredibly biodiverse ecosystems. They are as biodiverse or as productive as tropical forests on land. Here, particularly in South Africa, some of our areas are so incredibly biodiverse and have such a biomass, which is the number of animals, that pound for pound, it matches or is 10 times that of the Serengeti per square kilometer. That's really how what the biomass is like in some areas, and that's how productive it can be. Visually, just think of a forest underwater. That's really what it looks like. And still a lot of science is needed, and there's actually very little awareness as well, because most people are not aware of it. If you don't dive or swim in areas where kelp is found, then obviously you will not know what it looks like. And there isn't enough science. There's some brilliant people working, but there isn't enough science for us to be able to categorically say that how many species are found, or what the species do, or whether any of the species within the forest, which ones are keystone species, which ones are indicator species, which ones are umbrella species. These kind of various designations that you would give in an ecosystem to understand how it functioned better isn't something that's been studied extensively with the kelp forest, because there are studies happening, but it's a slow process. The kelp in itself is a keystone species because, of course, it's an enormous ecosystem engineer, and it creates life around it and sustains life. So kelp in itself is a keystone species. And science today doing two very interesting studies on kelp. One is the carbon sequestration kelp does. So it sequesters carbon, sometimes much faster and more than mangroves and other forests on land. And the second study that they're doing, which is very interesting around kelp, is how kelp is actually helping and affecting ocean acidification. So ocean acidification is one of the biggest problems we're facing now with the excess dissolved carbon dioxide that the ocean is absorbing. So they feel that perhaps areas where kelp forests are found, where they're thriving, where they're doing well, helps absorb that excess carbon out of the water, and is probably helping with ocean acidification, but this is an ongoing study as well. So that's like a quick primer into kelp forest, but I'm sure Pippa or Faine or Carina can talk a little bit more about what it feels like to be in this forest.
Would either of you like to follow up?
How about you, Faine?
Hang on, unmuting myself. No, I think Swati gave a very, very good introduction to understanding it from, I guess, an intellectual perspective. In terms of a experiential space, I mean, it's just, you kind of have to do it in order to really understand, but it's like having this incredible three-dimensional liquid space with kelp stipes extending up to 10 meters above you. And you're flying through the space. That's what it feels like. At times, you're swinging through like a monkey would, like in Tarzan, and you're grabbing onto kelp stipes and you're flowing through the forest. So it really is, it's just like one of the most extraordinary spaces to be in. And then, of course, you have these light rays that come streaming through the fronds and the refractions and play of light. And it's, yeah, that's insane. Super beautiful.
Do you have any particular experiences or anecdotes from being in the forest that you think might help elaborate on what it's like to be there?
And I've heard the word magical used to describe it by multiple of you.
I mean, I think magical is something that one can apply to most natural spaces. It's when you really get into it, there's a like extraordinariness that develops out of that which is perceived to be ordinary. The kelp forest is just like particularly insane. I would have to say that. In terms of specific experiences, I mean, I think from my early childhood, I'd say that for me, kelp has become this sort of space where I've always felt extremely safe. There was a moment when I was, I think, 6 years old, and my brother and I were swimming in this seemingly protected bay, and all of a sudden this rapid movement of water started sucking us out. And the kelp was the only thing there that I could reach out to and hold on to. And my brother grabbed onto my foot, and it was that prevented us from being swept out to sea as two super young children. So I think, yeah, kelp's kind of a safe space for me. And I think it's a safe space for lots of different animals that live in that environment as well. creates a shelter. So yeah, I don't know, someone else can speak to other experiences.
I think something that happens, and it's not just because of the kelp forest, it's also because of the freezing cold water. And the fact that you're holding your breath, and the fact that you're often making yourself quite vulnerable because you can swim very far from the coast and into big waves, and you never know what sorts of animals you're going to meet out there. But on some of these dives, the experience can be very, very intense, and it just brings you like straight into the present. And that feeling of heightened awareness, which becomes even more heightened because of the cold, combined with the absolute beauty of light flickering through moving kelp leaves above you, and sometimes big animals coming into view, sometimes small animals doing crazy things that you never imagined, that starts to become a magical experience. You are left with a sense of awe.
Maybe just to clarify for the audience, everyone in the collective is skin diving as well when in the water. So it's a very sort of immersive, tactile experience, as you can imagine, and in very cold temperatures often.
Speaking to Faine's point about being safe, I totally feel that, because unlike everyone else at Sea Change, I was the complete non-swimmer. Had a near drowning incident as a child, nearly drowned, was terrified of water, wasn't comfortable in water, definitely never comfortable in the ocean. And it took me years I wouldn't say I've still overcome my fear, but it took me years to get comfortable enough and to feel curious enough. And the wonder, thanks to Pippa and Faine and Carina and everyone at Sea Change who made me curious and, interested enough to overcome that fear, in a sense, to go into that space. And I think if it hadn't been a space with kelp, I would have perhaps never learned to be in the water or learned to swim even in a halfway decent way, because the kelp is like this large buoyancy device. And anytime that I feel a little bit vulnerable, or I feel out of breath, or I feel I can't keep up, then I just pull myself into an area where there's dense kelp, and I can literally just either lie on top like it's a raft, or just hold on to the kelp till someone comes to get me. And so it makes me feel incredibly secure. So if it wasn't for the Great African Sea Forest, I don't think with no amount of coaxing would have I gotten into the water. So I totally do get when Faine says about feeling safe in that environment. The other thing is, as Pippa said, that wonderful feeling of being incredibly present, of like being in that moment, in the now. You just leave all of your thinking of the past and your projections into the future, and all of that just leaves your head, and you're so aware and you're so connected in that moment, and you're just feeling the water on your skin, and you're feeling the slide of the fronds on your skin, or you're holding your breath, or you're pulling yourself down in the stipe, or you've seen something extraordinary. It's just the most it's hard to, until you've had that feeling of being incredibly present and incredibly aware of just that second, and every second bleeds into the next second, to the next second, without you thinking, okay, now I've spent a minute or 2 minutes or 10 minutes, because you don't know. It's like you're just so present. And it feels like this should be the birthright of every human being, to actually feel like that. It's who we are designed to be. We should be like that the whole time. So it's this extraordinary 10 minutes or 15 minutes or 20 minutes that you go in there, where you just unlock yourself and you let yourself be that slightly wild human you're designed to be, is what, for me, is where the magic comes.
Yeah, and I also think something, checking I'm unmuted, and a question that we ask ourselves often that's specific to the kelp forest is, we know that this environment has been around for hundreds of thousands of years, and we know that human beings have lived on this coastline for hundreds of thousands of years. And we sort of wondered if using the kelp as a buoyancy device, being able to use the kelp as something to pull yourself down on, could have been one of the things that got people into the water 100,000 years ago. Could it have been something that our ancestors used as a kind of gateway to learning to swim. So it's definitely alive in our psyches.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about specifically about the relationship between the experience of diving in your particular way of doing it. So your skin divers, your breath hold divers, and the relationship of this to your method of learning about the environment. Because you're not just storytellers, you're not just documentarians, you're also actively learning about, like Swati did a good job of talking about scientific knowledge about the kelp forest, but in a way what you can sea change can be described as like taking a slightly different approach to learning about ecology in this area. Can you talk a little bit about this kind of embodied experience you've been talking about and its relationship to learning about that environment?
So I'll just start a little bit. So we talk about this idea of a hive mind and living science. And we say that because all 7 of us are going into the kelp forest very, very regularly, and we are discovering mysteries and sharing stories about things that we've seen. And when you have 7 people all sharing these stories together, you get this almost kind of hive knowledge starting to form. And we discuss those things, and then we start solving the mysteries collectively. So it's living science in that, obviously all the things that we're working with are alive, but we are living those experiences and figuring things out in quite an organic way. I think maybe Faine can give an example of how these things.
An example. I mean, I guess to further Pippa's point, it's really, and I guess other people's points, when you're in this space, there's a total presence to your current situation. So your observation and all your senses become such a critical factor in interacting with the entire ecosystem. I mean, I think we are still learning how to become observant. I think a lot, animals have a far better or wild animals have a far better sense of being observant and being able to sense things. And I think what we're trying to do is get back into that and to remember that aspect of our wildness and to remember how to sense and experience the world and observe it. And I guess the kind of one of the main ways that we are doing that is through this underwater tracking, which was something that Craig had started developing based on his experience and time with the San people. And those people, of course, are extremely connected to the wild. They are in their own way, like fully wild, and I mean that in the best possible sense. So yeah, Craig took his experience from making films with the San people and tried to apply it to an underwater space. And he did that through observing animal behaviors, through observing like tiny little predation marks. And from that, you are able to build like a picture or an understanding of what happened in the past, what is currently happening, and what you might be able to expect to happen in the future. So there's this entire sort of, I guess, way of experiencing through observation. I don't know whether that helps clarify.
Quite a cool example would be sometime last year, we had a team meeting and Carina arrived at Craig's house and she had this amazing video on her cell phone of baboons that had come down to the rocks at a place called Castle Rock, and they were turning the rocks over and eating something. And we kind of looked very, very carefully. And there's an animal that we often observe and photograph in the intertidal area called an intertidal spider, which is this very cool, tiny little creature with giant fangs that can live underwater and creates an artificial lung around itself and builds its nests under these under these rocks, so that with a big kind of air chamber inside them, so that even when the tide comes in, that the spider and the spider's babies stay dry. Anyway, so Carina showed us this video, and we were like, wow, the baboons are coming down and they're finding these spider nests underneath the rocks. And that was like a big aha moment. Now, when we walk along the shore and we see all of these rocks that have been turned over with the empty spider nests, 2 years ago, we would have thought, you know, the tides come in and it's rolled the rocks around and that's what's happened to the spiders. But now we know actually the tide's been really low, the baboons have come down and they've just been smashing all those nests. So that's kind of how the hive mind works, and yeah, how we all contribute to this knowledge of tracking. And yeah, which feeds into a scientific understanding as well of the ecology.
Yeah. And I think not wearing wetsuits and having scuba gear and all of it is, you know, the environment is quite intimate. It's not, you know, there aren't wide spaces between kelp types that, you know, I'm not saying you can't go in, and a lot of people go in with scuba gear and dive in the kelp forest, but for us, apart from the cold and, you know, the experience of adapting to the cold and what the cold in itself does for your physiology and your mind, apart from that, just to not go in weighed down or with the suit and the scuba and all of it, it's a very intimate space. A lot of the animals are very cryptic, very hidden, very small. You know, you're going to freak them out if you're blowing bubbles and like kicking and moving around in a way that, you know, disturbs the energy there. And you may miss a lot of very interesting behavior, because then you're really only going to be able to see the obvious bigger behavior. You're going to miss like the finer details. And also, you know, the other thing is it's a world where things are a bit slow. So, you know, when you look at a starfish and you see it moving, it's not moving very fast. When you see it hunched over to kill something, you know from science that it's sort of engulfed whatever it is that it's killing with its stomach. And then as it's killing it, it pours hydrochloric acid down, dissolves whatever animal it is that it is killing, and sucks it in like a smoothie. You know this is science. But in order to like really feel it and observe it in the way that Sea Change likes to do it, to tell the story and to have it, like to film it, it's almost like you have to slow down along with that animal and see what it is that's doing. So it's this very, very intricate, intimate environment. And somehow it feels that if you are not in that space to be intimate and intricate yourself, there's a lot that you're going to miss.
Adrian, did you have something to ask as a follow-up?
No, I was just going to comment on the topicality of the baboon interaction, given what we know about the Cape Peninsula baboons and how much of a focus there is on them at the moment, but nothing more.
These stories that you're telling us, I think this is really interesting in the context of, you know, we titled this event around the idea of tentacular storytelling. So throughout the time that I've known and interacted with you, I've heard people describing, people who are part of Sea Change, describing experiences in terms of encountering the alien, in terms of awakening. Somebody used the term rewilding ourselves, discovering new magics, dissolving boundaries, and through it all speaking about like the relationality between people and the non-human world that you're encountering in quite a different way than we tend to see that relationship represented in a lot of ecological texts, for example. and other forms of documentary. So all of this way of describing really has reminded Adrian and I, in particular, of this notion of tentacular, this idea of kind of like putting to the side, what we're taught is rational, that makes humans exceptional, that this idea of bounded individualism. I want to know, or I want to ask, sorry. So you've talked about the aspect of your methodology that goes into kind of learning and how storytelling figures into the learning and observation process within the project. But I want to ask a little bit more about your methods for communicating to other people about the kelp forest. Sorry, that was a long rambling preamble, but so a lot of people who are joining us today will have seen the documentary My Octopus Teacher, which is only one example of your group's approach to storytelling, and a very outwardly looking example. So can you tell us a little bit about that the approach to talking about to people who aren't within your group about what you're experiencing?
I can go. I think what we do a little bit differently is we're not afraid to be very, very personal in terms of how we talk about nature and how we talk about things that have happened to us in the natural world. We rely on kind of, as Swati was saying earlier, we're not afraid to put ourselves in the story and be very subjective, actually, in terms of how we describe the things that we've seen and experienced and interactions with animals. And certainly from a conservation journalism point of view, I used to work only with marine biologists. And what drew me to Sea Change and what I found so refreshing was this very personal approach to talking about the natural world. And we can't claim that our experience is everybody's experience. It never could be. But to give yourself the freedom to be able to talk about the fact that, when you're swimming with a juvenile humpback in 4 meters of water and it's swooping down and feeding in front of you and then rolling its eye back in its head and looking at you and making contact with you, it feels like magic, and it feels like you can sense that creature's curiosity in the same way that you are wondering what's going on in its head. I'm pretty sure it's the same question is going through its own mind. And coming from very kind of structured science writing, which I got to the point where I was quite frustrated by it, because I could see that all of these amazing, incredible scientists I was working with, they got into what they were doing because they really, really loved the animals that they were working with. It generally came from a childhood obsession, a childhood curiosity, a childhood love for nature and for animals. But the deeper and deeper they got into science and scientific writing and getting grants and only being allowed to talk and describe things within certain boundaries, the less free they were. And as a storyteller and a communicator, I felt like we were missing an opportunity to reach people's hearts with this incredible research and these incredible stories of these scientists. And yeah, that's what kind of pulled me into Sea Change, was the way that Craig and Ross and Carina were communicating about the natural world went straight to my heart. And I think, the world is in a difficult place. So we need to think about we can't just be using empirical information. It is very important, like it's absolutely critical, don't get me wrong, I'm not undermining it in any way, but there are other ways of communicating as well that are valuable when it comes to conservation storytelling. And that's the first thing that Jane Goodall says, is if you want to change someone's behavior, speak to their heart. So that's certainly an approach that we took with the film.
I wonder if I might just flag Ben Cousin's question, and I think you've just touched on it, Pips. He was asking, what's the larger significance of your approach in the world today? And I think speaking about empathy, affect, relationality, and reaching out seems to speak to that. Do you have anything more you want to add to that in response to the question?
I mean, I don't know if anyone else wants to add to it. No? Yeah, well, I mean, I guess what we're doing is an experiment. We actually don't know. We're not sure what the results are going to be, but certainly from the response we've received to the film, and I'm hoping Carina can jump in because she's been monitoring everything. We've at the very least, we've reached an audience that would never normally engage with natural history, would never normally be part of this conversation about people and nature. You know, for better or worse, that these people have been talking about the natural world and talking about our relationship to nature that is beyond the scope of resource use, which is the normal lens.
I'd like to get some thoughts from Carina as well, especially in relation to another question that came through from the YouTube thread from Matt Adams. Matt says, I'm in awe of Pippa et al. Getting this made. As an academic involved in the power of narrative and multi-species storytelling, I'm keen to hear about the cultural appetite for getting stories like this told. So what, you know, what sorts of feedback have you gotten in regards to what Matt calls this cultural appetite?
I think just going back to what everyone, Swati, Faine, Pippa, sort of started off was this personal narrative, not being afraid to tell the personal story. And like with anything that when you talk about it in the eye or that experience, it doesn't have to be specifically profound. It just is genuine to yourself. And that's what has been communicated, I guess, through the film, but through anything else, whether it's a blog or an exhibition, and that it isn't about positioning the eye because we want attention to come that way. It's just how we share and tell that story. And that's, you know, I have the privilege of being info at Sea Change. So being a very, very small organization, you wear many, many different hats, and being that funnel. So when the film went out and suddenly it was like, oh my hat, there was just communication coming in literally by the second. And it happened for possibly for 3 weeks. It just came in, and you couldn't even read it fast enough. But I would say that 99% of the response was one of connection, where people felt actually good about themselves, as opposed to being smacked on the knuckle because you've been told something horrible and you feel really bad, because we are all part of what's going down, this sixth mass extinction, which is as a result of human play. But here, for once, is a story of connection and people. I mean, I read an email today from a 21-year-old who had said, you know, sort of thank you for connecting him to his childhood. I mean, he's not far out of his childhood, and I've even got it up here. He says, thank you for igniting my mind with passion, curiosity, and inspiration. Thank you for making me a better person. A person that wants to make an impact and turn this world into a better place to live in. So this is a 21-year-old male. And this kind of response gives me so much hope to go that I think we might actually be able to shift the needle in conservation, in climate change, by inspiring people to share their own stories, which they have done. Most people have written back with some anecdote, some experience, whether it's their own or something that they've shared with a class. And for many people, they seem to have wanted to watch the film more than once, sort of once or twice or three times, with either from a very, very young audience to a much, much older audience. So there's been something there that's resonated. And I don't know if I've waffled off, but I guess the biggest, the hope for me is when you see a film like ours go out, and then hot on its tails, you get this incredible film by Sir David Attenborough, and you go, oh my word, it can feel overwhelming at times. Like, why are we doing this? It feels quite hopeless. I mean, maybe I should just spend more time and just dive, because it's pretty amazing. But you feel like, maybe we can actually make a difference. And I think, if we've got folks like you, Adrian and Amber and Nathan, that are going in and looking at this emotional ecology, this way of storytelling, and if we've got some big name organizations coming to us and going, what's your formula? We're like, what do you mean, what's your formula? We don't have a formula as such, but if we can get a formula out there, and if it can tip the needle and it can make a positive difference, then I'll continue doing what I'm doing till the end of days, because it actually is amazing. It's a lot of fun, and we get to speak to people like you. So thank you.
So My Octopus Teacher was launched on, I think, the 7th of September. So it's been out there circulating as kind of a cultural object in the world for a couple of months now. I was wondering if any of you would like to share kind of how you're feeling following the launch of something that ended up being quite popular, to say the least. There has been, just from looking at social media and things like that, just a spectrum of response to it, from, people crying to getting really, really angry, to just being moved, to calling it, erotica or the scariest horror story ever written. So that's just kind of like the spectrum, thinking about things on Twitter and other social media. So can you talk a little bit about how you're feeling post-launch, and maybe give an example of something, a really memorable, maybe unexpected reaction?
I think maybe Pippa, you want to answer that, as you crafted the story and you fought for the story, because it's your first film, and you went up, and there were some very strong heavyweights in the film industry that went, Bambi should die here or there or whatever, and you went, no, I want it to be I want people to feel good about this film. And I remember you came back from Bristol literally broken, but still very, very strong, because I had this image of you sort of holding an old-fashioned film reel under your arm, kind of in a way, and just going like, you want to do it your way, and you want to tell it your way. And I think everybody just said, we just stood behind you and went, okay, and you told it your way, and it's I don't think any of us made a film with a very specific end goal, other than we wanted to share a story of the great African sea forest and how amazing we feel in that environment. And I think you really succeeded in that. So I think this question is for you, Pippa, to answer.
Thanks, Carina. I think that's exactly it. Thank you. It's just thinking about, like, my only goal when I started this is, if I can just give a glimpse of what it feels like to be in that kelp forest, in that state of presence, when the light is filtering through the leaves, when you eye to eye with an octopus or a shark or whatever animal you are lucky enough to be in contact with. and to give people a sense of how kind of nourishing that can be. And in terms of how I feel now, I think our whole team has quite some strong feelings after all of this. I think we were not prepared to wake up on a Tuesday morning and be getting an email every 3 seconds. We didn't know that Zach Braff and Ava DuVernay and Diana Ross were going to be talking about our film. So there's a sense of complete like sort of shock and overwhelm on one level, which is but then also this sense of like gratitude and what a privilege to be able to share your experience and your sense of, I mean, it really is just a sense of deep love for this incredible planet that we live on and we're so lucky to be part of. And to actually have some of that mirrored back at you in emails like the one you just read to us. And really, I think there's so many stories out there that say, don't be part of this terrible thing that's happening. So to have been part of a story where the message is, come and be part of something that's amazing. We all belong here, and let's engage with this place with a sense of wonder. And to realize that people liked hearing that and were inspired by it. It's enormously affirming and encouraging and exciting. And as you said, Carina, it just makes me want to carry on, even though I'm pretty exhausted, and it's been a wild ride these last few months. But yeah,
I think it's also been fascinating that we've had reactions from all the way from 4-year-olds upwards, so children are seeing something and they're getting something out of it, and then teenagers are seeing something and they're getting something out of it, and then young adults are seeing it and they are getting something out of it. So, and then that's your general audience, adults, families, they're watching it together as a family and all of that. But you're also getting different people from different groups or different ways of perceiving the world. They're watching it and they're taking out their own meaning from it. And I think the beauty of a piece of film when you put it out there is that I think the power of this film, and thanks to Pippa and Craig and James, they did such a wonderful job with it, that it allows for it to go beyond the boundaries of a natural history film or a wildlife film or a conservation film. You cannot actually label this film as anything. It stands up on any level with any kind of documentary that's out there, from, it could be a documentary on drug addicts all the way down to this documentary on connection with an octopus, to, your audience. You can't say this is our audience because, you don't have a target audience. It seems to have appealed at a level across, age groups and cultures and, people with different belief systems. I mean, it's been interesting. As Carina said, we've gotten all the vegan males, and we've gotten the vegetarian males, and we've gotten the animal right males, and we've gotten the males on erotica. And I've personally, a lot of tweets on whether Craig's wife had left him or divorced him or didn't support him, or where was she in this whole situation. So, I got a lot of that. But what's fascinating is you don't want to argue against any of it, because that's the beauty of a piece of art. If it doesn't do that, even if people get mad and they hate it, or if it doesn't make you uncomfortable, if it doesn't question certain things, if it doesn't shake who you are in that moment to make you slightly different in the next moment, and if it's done that, then you can be really proud that what you've done is not just a film, it's actually a piece of art. And I think, I can say that definitely Pippa, James, and Craig have created that kind of thing with this film. And it's been fascinating. I mean, we can personally have issues with some of the interpretations, because you're going, hang on a minute, I would have never expected that interpretation to come through. But that's fair, because everybody sees and takes what is their experience when they're watching something, and how can you argue that and deny them that experience? So it's been very, very interesting, all the way from celebrity endorsements down to, you know, those massive Twitter threads on erotica, and then having wonderful email coming from children who are like sending us sketches of octopus, and fourth graders who've just done a big project on octopus and have written to Mr. Craig Foster. And, you know, like it's been, yeah, very interesting and lovely and wonderful altogether. Yeah.
I just have a follow-up. I think, Carina, you had a really intriguing question about some of the backstory of fighting for the film. And Pips, in our discussions, we've talked about some of the pressures for you really to develop a conservation message or have a target and that sort of thing. But I think, would it be fair to say, you know, if there's a moniker coming out of this, you find your teacher or experience your own ecology and the connections and subjectivities within it? Does that seem something of a message, you know, returning to Ben's earlier prompting, that comes out of My Octopus Teacher, or something you were consciously telling?
Absolutely. I mean, you know, there's an existing formula for conservation storytelling, which is to set up a problem, point out who the bad guys are, say, these are the heroes, you can be a hero too, help us stop these bad guys.
Donate here.
Donate here. I mean, there are all sorts of, but what's always been a little bit uncomfortable for me about that is conservation is incredibly complicated. You know, when it comes to something like poaching, for example, very easy to point fingers at someone who's just killed a rhino and chopped its horn off, but the story behind that guy is that he's desperately trying to feed and send his children to school. So I've always been uncomfortable with that. And I suppose, yeah, as you're saying, this because I'd had such powerful experiences in terms of my own love for the natural world, and because I'd seen this little flame that was alive in every scientist who I've ever interviewed, really this fascination for me came from speaking to all of these incredible biologists who had been doing what they did for so long, but were not really comfortable talking about why they'd started. And I guess I felt like this was something universal. And if we had focused on a specific conservation issue, such as octopus traps entangling whales, the story would have gone from being a universal story about connection to nature to here's a problem that needs to be solved, and these are the bad guys. And there is space for those stories. They are incredibly important. Like, they really, really, really are. And I've written many, many magazine stories like that. I just wanted this to be different. I felt like this is, yeah, something that, and the story of, you know, what happened between Craig and the octopus was so powerful, and had such a powerful impact on him. I just thought that was the thought I wanted people, the feeling I wanted people to leave with when the film finished. A sense of awe and wonder. Sorry?
Shout out to Craig.
Yeah, exactly. I don't know if does that answer your question? Yeah.
Yeah, so My Octopus Teacher is only one example of your approach to storytelling. And if one of you liked, you could share the Sea Change URL in the chat in case people want to look at other examples of the kind of multimedia storytelling that you've done that might be available from that website. But yeah, we've gone on just over an hour so far. So I do want to finish up this part with kind of one overarching question before we move into the Q&A from other folks who are here with us. And this, is not an easy question to answer, but might be one to kind of reflect on through the Q&A as well. So I want to follow up on kind of the broader significance as well. So, considering the wider societal context, the fact that we've been, living for nearly a year under a global pandemic, constantly thinking about intensifying crises of the climate, escalating global inequalities, coping with pandemic disease, the acceleration of enclosures for, mineral extraction, destroying ecosystems, these lessons that, that you learn about, or that you learn in the kelp forest and that you tell stories about, whether it be about the method in general, about relationships, or about particular experiences you've had. What do you think, or do you think that these have, broader relevance for thinking about the way that people care, not just, in relation to the non-human or the more than human world? Meow. Hi, cat. But the way we care for each other and the ways that we structure and live in society. So I'm just going to drop that there, which is kind of a big question, but maybe we can think about it as we move forward. And I'll give you just a chance if you want to reflect on that, and then we'll move into the Q&A, if that's okay.
I just have one quick comment on that, which is that I think one of the things that has led us to where we are in terms of the sixth mass extinction and the terrifying world that we're leaving for the people that come after us is we've kind of lost our respect for nature. And that's not just, and it's not just reflected in our relationship with nature, but we've lost our respect for one another as well. And I think we've had a comment that's come up often, and it was something that Swati kind of jumped on very early on, because in the beginning we were actually getting a lot of criticism for not having a specific conservation message and not making a traditional impactful. And Swati, I remember what she said is, well, climate change is terrible, and poaching is terrible, and biodiversity loss is terrible, and pollution is terrible. All these things are really terrible, but they're all a symptom of our disconnection from the natural world and from ourselves and from one another. Because if we felt that connection, if we were as fully aware as we should be, we would not be able to treat our surroundings in the way that we do. I don't know if you want to jump on, Swats.
Yeah, no, it's just that, it's really one of the most profound experiences you have when you're in nature, and that goes for anybody. So it doesn't make me or someone else special that we've had it. Anyone who goes in, when you have those deep relationships or experiences in nature, is that you feel the living world around you. And once you feel that living world around you, it automatically connects you. It's empathy. That is fundamentally singularly the most important human quality. Because, if you look at humans as a species, and we are animals, originally we thought ourselves superior because of tool use, and science and biology has proven that other animals use tools. Then we thought, language. But now we know that a lot of animals have their own language. Not only when they communicate with each other, they're very sophisticated ways of communicating interspecies. Then we thought, culture. This is what separates us. We have communities, we build culture. This is who we are. No. When you take whale pods, for example, humpback whale pods in Australia have different accents to their clicks than do humpback whales in South America. That's a kind of culture. The way they learn to hunt certain species as opposed to others, that's a kind of culture. The matriarchal system that they function in, the way they pass knowledge down, that's a kind of culture. So tool use, culture, language, everything that we thought that would makes us separate as a species, that's out. Then we thought, oh, it must be technology. But really, I mean, compared to the natural system and the natural matrix and how nature actually functions, our technology is in nursery school. It's baby stuff, compared to, when you think of the power that powers a blue whale, when it dives and swims, when you think of a seed knowing to become a oak tree or an acorn tree or any of the trees, that's a kind of technology. So everything that we thought separates us is actually pretty much found in the animal kingdom. If there is one thing, it's translated differently in animals, but if there's one thing that not separates us in the sense of separates us because we're too bound in nature, I mean, as in perhaps is the one thing that makes us human, as in slightly different, if you were looking at qualities, is empathy. We are a species where what makes me in a subway when a mother's coming on with her baby in a trolley, and she has a handbag and an umbrella, I will reach out and try and help her get onto the subway to not miss the train, or I will get up and offer my seat to an older person. I do all of that not because it's going to bring me any reward. I'm not going to get something out of it. It's just something most humans will do. Most humans on this planet are kind, decent, empathetic people. And that empathy, that when it starts to erode, and as Pip said, when that disconnection starts to come in, where we start disrespecting each other, then the cascade of stuff that translates into what happens is huge. This reminds me of a story I read a long time ago about the Black Forests in Germany, where the scientists were studying the last pack of wild wolves, and prospectors there had found tin deposits, and then they wanted to come there and I think do exploration to see if tin and nickel was found in those mountains, and this would involve strip mining. There was a couple of small communities living in the area, and they said that if they allowed for strip mining to happen there, it would allow the economy to improve. It would bring jobs to this area, which was very depressed. This would allow maybe a school to open up, allow medical centers to come in. So they had this great argument on why the strip mining of this area of Black Forest should be allowed, because it would be so economically beneficial and so much better for the people. The two scientists studying the wolves there fought the idea of strip mining, because strip mining just ruins the entire environment and would mean the loss of habitat for this last pack of wild wolves. And people said, oh, but they're just wolves. There are people here in this community, struggling. So why are we even having this conversation? It should be a no-brainer. And one of the scientists wrote a letter saying, today it is wolves. Tomorrow it will be another community of people for the greater good. Where do we stop? So I think that is really the big question. And I think in terms of bringing out that idea of connection, for us to make and feel those connections, that is what, when empathy grows, then you organically, automatically want to be better, do better. It's love at the end of the day. When you love somebody, you want them to do better, be happy, not because you're getting something from it. It's just you purely want that for that person. So if we can create that between us and for us as humans, just between humans, and for humans and the natural world, I think we could change the entire way we're doing this. Yeah.
I'm glad the story at the end also implicated capitalism, though, because I'm sure a lot of academics in this forum might also want to mention that. Over to you, Amber.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing. I'm like, but how do you teach capitalism empathy? But I think from there, if everybody's all right with it, we can start taking some questions. We've had a couple come through. One is you mentioned an impulse of sea change is not being afraid to put yourselves in the story, and you've discussed this from the perspective of the human and the human-animal encounter story. But what about the kelp forest story? Could you talk more about your role as storytellers, negotiating with your own impact on the kelp forest, both when you're diving in it and when you tell its story?
Yeah, so I think that's a really important question. I'm glad that someone asked it, and it's something that we kind of are very aware of, and we're evolving in our approach all the time. We also, and one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot, for example, is you know, we really wanted to showcase the Great African Sea Forest. We wanted to make this ecosystem well known, and because we wanted people to see value in it. And part of that value would be getting people from all over the world wanting to come and experience it and dive here. Because if it's got, you know, economic value, talking to capitalism again, our government's more likely to want to protect it. But the impact of that in terms of having more and more people in the environment is really something to consider. And I think one of the things that we might want to do this year, and we're now planning our impact campaign around the film, but we didn't have the resources to run an impact campaign 4 months ago. Now everything's different, but one of the things that I'd quite like to do is get all of the tourism operators who operate in and around Cape Town to come into one place and talk about how we're going to make sure that this happens responsibly. And that, you know, people are not standing places where they shouldn't be standing, or engaging with animals in a disrespectful way. And actually, I think most operators around Cape Town are really good. All the ones that I've been out with have been very, very conscious of their impact on the environment. And from a more kind of storytelling point of, specifically from a storytelling point of view, I think, of course, we can't pretend that we are objective observers and that by being there, we're not changing the way that animals behave and the things that we see. And that has, you know, it's been a question that's come up a lot with regards to the film. And yeah, it's something that we're aware of. I'm not sure what the answers are. I can say that we try to be as non-intrusive as we can be. Yeah, and I don't know if anyone has something to add there, Faine?
Maybe to speak to that. I think in terms of how we approach this environment.
Faine, could you speak up, please?
Sorry, is that better? Better? Good? Okay. So going back to Pippa's point in terms of like cognizance of interacting with an environment, I think there's an aspect of how we interact. So we have it in our minds that nature is something that is separate to us and that it needs to be treated in a certain way, etc., etc. Thinking that we are separate. And I think the more time you spend in an environment, the more you realize that your environment, you are as much a part of it as it is a part of you. And when you enter that state, it's like you automatically respect it. You automatically interact with it in a way that is in some ways totally profound, in other ways totally ordinary. And yeah, I mean, in the end, it just feels like you're another seal or another fish or whatever that's moving through like a 3-dimensional underwater forest. So yeah, there's like a mindset shift where you're not thinking, oh, this is how I have to interact with nature. It is some sort of space I'm going into that is different from me. It's just, you're there and you're present and the environment is you and you are the environment. Yeah, and that's unfolding respect is just something that happens naturally.
And the environment responds differently to you as well when you go in with that space of mind, I suppose. I think these sharks that we swim with often, they're called spotted gully sharks. And they're these beautiful, really, really fast animals, and they aggregate in big groups. And every time I swim after them, I have to like give myself a bit of a talk in my head before, because if you approach them with the wrong, I don't want to say energy, but if you barge in there and you're trying to get a photograph and you start chasing one, they all just disappear. That's it. They're gone. You miss your chance. But if you float quietly on the surface and you pull yourself carefully down the kelp stack and you don't kick your fins and you just sit there quietly holding your breath and holding onto the kelp, you can have 30 animals circling around you, brushing your skin, you know, kind of touching your mask, and they don't mind you being there. Yeah, and it's so by being non-obtrusive, you have much better and far more authentic experiences, actually. I don't know. I mean, I hope we're answering the question. If anyone wants to redirect us, that's also fine.
I think that was well done. Just to add to Joanna's question, I mean, part of the story of this kelp is at least one of resilience in the face of climate change for the moment, at least from my understanding of the changing ecology there. Maybe, I think, Ben Cousins, you've got your hand up. Nathan, it's a bit of a break with the request to get people to type the questions, but we can make an exception. Nathan, are you able to unmute Ben so that he can put his question? And then we've also got Jen, and I just note Bart, just yes, from Cork in Ireland, just noting the importance of this kind of work. So thanks, Bart. Ben, over to you.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Adrian. So I'm a retired academic who moved to Simonstown at the beginning of the year, and I've been swimming in the kelp forest a lot, and trying to teach my 4-year-old granddaughter to snorkel at the same time. And the other day I came across a spear fisherman at Miller's Point who'd caught a 2-ton fingerfin. And Miller's Point, where the octopus movie was made, is actually a bit denuded of catchable fish. And I said to him, this guy, like, you know, what do you have to catch and eat these beautiful species? And he came up with the argument, well, you know, given the fact that most meat that most protein that I can buy is produced by industrial farms, this is surely a more appropriate way to feed myself protein. And so that really shook me. It's like an argument for extractivism based on some sort of ecological argument about sustainability. And I've always been very sympathetic to sustainable use arguments, for example, in community wildlife programs. But since being in the kelp forest, I've questioned my own assumptions about this and thought, well, you know, is it not basically based on the notion of, you know, the nature is there to feed us? And so how do we reconcile these things? You know, we do need to be able to allow small-scale fishermen to have a living. At the same time, we need to encourage a very different attitude. And it seems to me there's an inherent tension there. So I've also noticed that in the last couple of months that people that I'm in the water with do talk about the octopus movie. So I think it is making an impact. But I think the challenges to rethinking how we relate to nature are actually not at all easy. I don't think there are any easy answers to this at all. And I think that we're all needing to experiment a great deal. And I think Pippa's probably right. You know, more dialogue with people who take tourists around the coast, with the fishing industry and so on is actually at the core of this. And it's finding ways to amplify those conversations somehow or other, and not clear, neat, like how to do it type of answers, something along those lines.
And I think that's actually a really, really great point. And this is where hard science, biological research could not be more important, because those kind of intricate understandings of the environment, you know, we need biologists to help us figure this stuff out. And when it comes to spearfishing, for example, what I always say, and we meet a lot of spear fishermen like this, is, you know, I look at them and I say, you know, you just shot a fish that's like, you know, it could be 40 years old. That red Roman that you just shot has been swimming around this place. He was probably the leader of his family because he's big. And in those fish communities, you have one male and lots of females. And because you've shot him, you've slowed down the breeding rates of that family a whole lot, because now one of the females is going to have to go through a whole process of changing her sex. Most of them actually know that some species of reef fish live for like 60 years. So I think that's where really knowing our stuff as people who engage with nature and having a good sense of the facts is critical. But it's not simple either. And the answers are not simple.
I wonder then if we maybe move on, Ben, if you're happy with that. I thought it was quite a good answer. If we can move on to Jen, she's talking more broadly about what broader influence of indigenous ontologies, ways of knowing and being in the world, and what do you draw on? What further do you draw on? I mean, some of the influences are obvious, and I know Swati and Carina have talked about those, but can you speak more to the influence of indigenous ontology in your practice and storytelling?
Swati? You muted.
Are you saying specific to sea change and sea change stories, or in general indigenous ontologies for storytelling in general?
I think the way she framed the question, thanks for the really rich conversation. I'd like to know, aside from learning from sand tracking that you mentioned, and submerging this learning onto the seafloor and sea forests, have indigenous ontologies where embodied ways of knowing and storytelling are integral, have these been drawn on? So I guess beyond the sand or other indigenous ontologies or a broader...
Of course, mainly the sun, because there's been direct experiential interaction with sun, and spent a lot of time, and so Craig's whole tracking idea in many ways or learning came from the sun. So of course there's a direct relation there. But I think any of us who are looking for this kind of deeper connection, looking at deep nature immersion, looking at this practice of going to a place to know it in a really intimate way, in a daily way, that is very much to do with indigenous practices anywhere in the world. Because for indigenous peoples, the land and them, there was just absolutely no separation. So I remember when we were working on a film called The Animal Communicator, I met a wonderful Aboriginal man from Australia who'd come down, and he had a band around his hand that basically said, talk to the land and we'll talk back to you. And I asked him about, I was trying to get him to talk about this new industrial age where we depend so much on technology and all of our sort of human inventions, which is disconnecting us from nature. So I was trying to ask him about what he thought was this disconnection from nature. What was that all about? And is he seeing it in younger Aboriginal people who may not, live in the original way? He actually did not understand my question, and it wasn't because of a translation problem. He literally couldn't understand how you could feel disconnected from nature, because it just didn't compute for him. So finally, I was trying to rephrase this question in 10, 20 different ways. And finally, he just stopped me and he pointed around him and he pointed to the sky and he pointed to a rock and he pointed to a bird and he said, rock, sky, river, bird, all of it. He used a word like Wallaja. He said family. And he said, I am family. And he says, you desecrate that, you desecrate this. So for him, he literally did not understand that word disconnect. So I think, in any kind of practice where you're trying to truly understand this idea that we belong, that we're the human animal, that we're part of this matrix, anything that we do that gets, has that thread coming through our practice or the work is very much from any indigenous way of living. It's San, that's what South Africa, there's our experience here, but it's anywhere in the world, anyone that you speak to. So that's entirely part of it. And I think to also say, I think where we've hugely missed an opportunity, not just sea change, I think the world in general has missed a massive opportunity, is that, again, science and biology are incredibly, incredibly important. But I think we've really not paid attention to indigenous stories which speak to our science today. And I think that enormous kind of disrespect that we've shown to indigenous knowledge and storytelling, which actually directly informs science, has been a massive lost opportunity for learning, especially of the natural world, that we've lost. And today they've lost the language, they've lost words. So many of the people don't live that wild anymore. And we've lost this massive, massive opportunity because we went this very empirical Western way of like in a box doing the science, when we should have brought along with us entirely the indigenous tradition. So I think we've done a great disservice when it comes to that. And I'm not saying sea change is doing any great sort of from that perspective. So I'm not positioning us like that, but I think our practices, most certainly, I think we are all very, very interested in indigenous tradition, indigenous knowledge, indigenous storytelling and ways of being. And that's a huge driver for us. Plus the fact that this coast, as Pippa mentioned, the ancestral connection that we have with it, that this coast allowed for the modern human mind, the origin of the modern human mind to take place, that for 150,000, 200,000 years back, till about 60,000 years ago when we moved all over Africa and then to the rest of the world, that humans lived wild on this coast and hunted and gathered on this coast. And that's where every single person on the planet has an ancestral and genetic link, is also something that inspires deeply. So I think that's very much part of how Sea Change would like to keep going with what we're doing. And I think the placing ourselves in the story and telling the personal and not being afraid to speak about the personal feeling is very much also to do with indigenous traditions, because you cannot sit around a fire with an indigenous person and not hear about the day's hunt without it very much being about the person and the animal and the whole dance that had happened. So I think that's also very much part of how we do our thing, if that answers the question.
Yeah. And I always find it fascinating the way that you all draw on evolutionary psychology in aspects of your understanding of the engagements that you have. Nathan's had another question directly relating to psychology, and he really brings up, well, the injured octopus dilemma, which was, I think, one of the biggest talking points that we've tracked, at least in the tentacles of Twitter. And he's pointing there at the sort of boundary between observation and intervention. And yeah, I wonder if any of you could speak more to that dilemma. On the one side on Twitter, we sort of had ecofeminists and queer sort of theorists asking why not engage more directly to intervene. And then on the other hand, with the alt-right, some really rejectionist understandings of the intimacy that was created in the encounter with the octopus. So Twitter's had this real polarization at the extremes. But I wonder if you could put yourself in Craig's shoes and your own shoes and think about, or just reflect on that dilemma. And then maybe to steer it towards Carina, in terms of this changing organization now on the back of this movie. I understand there are some changes afoot. How do you see this observation and intervention journey with the organization moving forward? So that's a two-parter.
So I'll start off the shark attack story, which as the person who was trying to get into Craig's head for very, very long time, this was certainly the part of the film that I struggled with the most. And people have even asked me, like, why is that the message that you told? Why did you want people to? And kind of found it a strange question, because it's not the message that I wanted to. We were sharing Craig's story, and I think it's something that he struggles with. Why he did what he did. Should he have behaved differently? I think anyone would struggle in a situation like that. And I don't really think there's an answer. I don't know what I would have done in that situation. And I also think that as human beings, we're evolving all the time. And who knows what Craig would do if something like that happened now. I don't know. Certainly something that we speak about often, and maybe Faine will elaborate on this later, is we told a story about the octopus, of course, but we're having experiences with all animals all the time, and that ecological web is so complex and so active. And one of the things I'm actually really sad about, maybe my only regret with the film that I reflect on often, is the pajama sharks have come out really looking like the bad guys.
Exactly.
There's been negative press about the bad guys. So a friend of mine who works for Save Our Seas, the organization I used to work for, was painting a mural. Putting up artworks for an outdoor exhibit the other day, and there was an image of a pajama shark, and someone came up to him and was like, you know, these pajama sharks, like they are terrible creatures. Did you see what they did to the octopus? And I think that's yeah, we actually tried to balance that better in different versions of the cut, but it just didn't fit in terms of telling a powerful story. But yeah, I think what Craig would tell you, and certainly this is a conversation Faine and I have had, is the sharks are just as important as the octopus. And the sharks are struggling too, and it takes the shark an awful lot of energy to come out of its den and chase that animal. And they're also, you know, those sharks live for kind of maybe 25 years. They're also endangered. They're a protected species. So how we decide that one animal's life is more valuable than another animal's life because we have become more attached to it, I'm not sure. It's confusing, and we're getting emails about this all the time, and I turn myself inside out trying to answer them.
I think one of the issues is that because there was a personal relationship, you assume, oh, now that you've liked this octopus and now this octopus has liked you back, then you're obliged to step in and do all of this stuff. Just so happened that this beautiful bond formed, but it formed out of observation and being there every day, which means it wasn't just the film was about this bond with the octopus, but if you were in that environment every day, you see sharks from when they're little eggs, like, you know, somewhere, and you see that shark develop, and you know what it takes, the amount of predation that happens for that shark to actually hatch. And then it's a tiny little pajama shark that like comes out, and for that little animal in the kelp forest with the hundreds of predators there, for it to then still survive to become an adult pajama shark. And then when you see that pajama shark predate on an octopus, whether you particularly love that octopus or not, personally for me, as someone who's been in wilderness for over 20 years, I really think that level of interference is not something that comes easy. It's not something that should come easy. It's good that it's a debate because it's always interesting. As I said, again, everybody relates to a situation differently, but I think it's a very hard decision to make at that point, because just because you didn't have the same bond with that shark, it doesn't mean you love it any less, because you have seen what it takes to be a shark in that environment. And the octopus that everyone loves so much wouldn't be as charismatic and as intelligent and as fantastic if she didn't have this predator challenging her day in and day out. You would just not have this incredible mollusk that grabbed all of our attention. You know, without that shark, most of her reactions and intelligence and the way that she is, that made us so excited about her, would just not exist.
Yeah. And I guess there you're speaking to broader points about not anthropomorphizing the story too much. Consider the subjectivity of the octopus, the shark, and Craig, or any one of us that might find ourselves in those sorts of situations. But I just want to talk, you talked about evolution. I wonder about then, as a last question from my side, Amber, just for Carina, where is sea change evolving to from this point?
you know, the film is one of the many stories that come out of the kelp forest and that we want to tell. And we're not going to gloss over that. I mean, it's had an incredible impact, and it seems like the story is not going to go away, and we don't want it to go away. But as a conservation organization, we have always wanted to tell the story, but to reach audiences that Netflix won't get. You know, and as Pippa, as the director, had decided that it wasn't going to be a conservation film as such. So here's an opportunity now with the film to go out and reach audiences in other ways of storytelling and engaging. So we've got quite a few projects that we are working on and that we will get involved in the next year, the next couple of years. A big part of it is we look at it nationally in South Africa, looking at an outreach campaign where we can reach audiences in South Africa through public engagement. We would like to work with local ambassadors from different regions in South Africa, that it's not just a sea change story and this is what went out. It's about an interpretation around using the film, being a catalyst. So we have these, we would like to go out and tell stories using exhibition as an art form, using performance, live theater, puppetry in as many different languages as we can in South Africa, as well as creating a global sea forest alliance. As we've mentioned, as Swati mentioned right at the beginning, 25% of our global coast is kelp forest. It's largely unknown. The film has done a great job. The Octopus has been an incredible ambassadress to talk about this unseen environment that is so important if you're looking at biodiversity having a role in climate change. So we've got this opportunity now, and what the film has done is certainly open doors of engagement. So we have this incredible opportunity to talk to people in different realms, in conservation, in filmmaking, to look at really meaningful partnerships. But Sea Change at its core is a very, very small organization. We don't want to land up really changing the ethos of that. So we want to go out and continue to tell stories about this environment and inspire people and inspire other people to tell their stories. So it's not about growing massively, but it's about creating a robust organization that can engage meaningfully. So to the extent that we've got a formula or a story or a film, it's like, here it is, take it, not you need to pay this to use it. It's like we really want to create as much of any resource that we have for anybody who really wants to engage with it in whichever way they want, provided they're not going to be, making huge amounts of money out of it, because the film actually belongs to Netflix. Then talk to us. So yeah, we've got some great projects planned, and we just want to go out and tell the story and reach audiences that possibly Netflix haven't reached, which is invariably, it's a big part of a South African audience, because it's a platform that is quite you need to have finances, you need to have electricity, you need to have all of these things to be able to see it. So we want to talk to audiences where Netflix hasn't reached. So I don't think things have changed that much since before the film or after the film. We had this plan, this impact campaign, which we want to continue doing. If anything, it maybe just inspires us to continue doing what we're doing and to feel like, yes, we can actually hopefully make a difference.
And we are specifically trying to protect our sea forest. Yeah, and convince our government that it's an important thing to do as well.
Yeah.
Folks, just in the interest of time, I'm going to just move to Bart quickly before we go to Amber to conclude. Bart, Nathan, can you bring him in?
Yeah, just very, very briefly, because that everything has happened to me in terms of power on a machine running out. So the real world, it's been a fantastic debate, presentation. I want to thank all the people involved. As indicated earlier, from Cork, Ireland, we're an island nation surrounded by water. And my work all my life has been in education. So the kind of question I have really is whether or not, the kind of thing I would think ambitiously as a seconded teacher working for the education system over 30 years, listening to this now, is how would I get Octopus into every school in Ireland? And the last speaker mentioned, Netflix owned this. So that is my question. So if, say, the Irish nation, the Irish school system, wanted to access, to motivate a whole new generation to look into our seas, then thanks for a very, very interesting presentation.
So there's a super simple answer to that, which is that Netflix has this amazing kind of platform for their documentaries where if it's an educational or community screening, and if it's free and it's specifically aimed at teachers, you can show the film to whoever you like for free, as long as you don't charge for tickets and you don't use it for fundraising. All that they ask is that you play the film using your Netflix account or download it onto an iPad and then project the film from there. So yeah, and I think Carina, once we are hoping to build a kind of viewing platform and have a whole lot of resources for teachers that want to use the film in that way. But as we said, we just want it to be useful in the world.
Thanks, Pippa, and thanks, Bart. I think I'm gonna pass back to Amber, but thanks from my side for a really great discussion, and thank you for all the questions.
Thanks, Adrian. Yeah, and thank you everybody for such a great set of questions to our audience out there, and also to everyone who's joined us as part of the roundtable. Thank you so much for your reflections, for adding to the debate and sharing your experiences. And this has been a really nice way to spend a cold afternoon in the UK on top of everything. Thank you so much.